We tend to think of the First World War in terms of ballistics. We measure the tragedy in high explosive tonnage, in millions of rounds fired, in the chaotic geometry of shrapnel. But for the infantrymen stepping off the reserve lines in Flanders or the Somme, the war did not begin with a bang. It began with a sound much more intimate and much more terrifying. The sound of suction. The wet, rhythmic slurping of thousands of hobnailed boots trying to pull themselves free from the earth. Before a soldier ever saw a German Feldgrau uniform or heard the crack of a Mauser, he had to survive the commute. And in the autumn of 1917, specifically during the Third Battle of Ypres, that commute was a lethal event in itself. We need to strip away the newsreel footage, which is usually sped up and jerky, and slow this down to the agonizing real-time pace of the march. Consider the physics of the British infantryman. He is equipped with the pattern 1908 webbing. It is a marvel of logistical design, intended to distribute weight evenly across the shoulders and hips. In dry training conditions on the Salisbury Plain, a soldier carries perhaps 60 pounds of kit, ammunition, entrenching tool, water bottle, small pack, large pack, rifle. It is heavy, but manageable. But in the Ypres salient, nothing remains dry. As the columns move forward under the relentless Atlantic depressions, the rain transforms that equipment. The standard issue greatcoat is made of thick, coarse wool. It is designed for warmth, but technically, it is a sponge. Historical analysis suggests that a fully saturated British uniform, combined with the waterlogged canvas of the webbing, absorbed between 15 and 20 pounds of water. This is dead weight. The soldier is no longer carrying 60 pounds. He is carrying 80 to 90 pounds. He is a pack mule, strapped into a harness of wet leather and sodden wool that constricts the chest and chafes the skin raw. And he is doing this while navigating terrain that has been pulverized by millions of artillery shells into a viscous, glue-like substance. The German officer and diarist Ernst Junger, a man who viewed war with a cold, almost scientific detachment, described this approach not as a march, but as a descent into a material storm. He noted how the landscape itself seemed to have dissolved. There were no roads. There were only duckboard's narrow wooden tracks, slick with slime, winding through a sea of cratered mud. To step off the duckboard was to court disaster. In the dark, loaded with that 80 pounds of wet gear, a slip meant falling into a shell hole filled with water and liquid chemical residue. If you were lucky, your squad mates pulled you out. If you were at the tail of the column, or separated by the shelling, you simply vanished. The mud of Flanders had a suction force that required mechanical aid to break. Men drowned in the open air, anchored by the very equipment meant to help them fight. We must also look at the physiology of this march. Medical studies on caloric expenditure estimate that trudging through knee-deep mud requires 4 to 5 times the energy of walking on hard ground. These men were burning upwards of 4,000 calories a day just to reach the front line. Their rations? Often cold bully beef and hardtack, rarely exceeding 2,500 calories. They were arriving at the point of contact already in a state of caloric bankruptcy, physically hollowed out before the first whistle blew. The French barrel maker turned corporal, Louis Barthès, captured the psychological toll of this soaking in his notebooks. He didn't write about glory or patriotism. He wrote about the crushing weight. He described the rain not as weather, but as a malice that soaked into the soul. For Barthès, and millions like him, the rain stripped away their humanity before the enemy could. A man shivering uncontrollably, coated in a layer of freezing slime, unable to feel his feet, is no longer a tactician. He is an animal trying to regulate his body temperature. This is the context we miss when we look at maps with arrows pointing toward Passchendaele. We see the movement of a division and assume it is a chess piece sliding across a board. We do not see the reality. The reality is a 19-year-old boy from Manchester or Lyon, his boots disintegrating, his skin gray with cold, marching into a horizon of gray water. He is not afraid of the bullet yet. He is afraid that if he stops moving, the earth will simply swallow him whole. As they reached the communication trenches, looking for shelter, they found none. The dugouts were flooded. The trench floors were rivers. The realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. There is no inside. There is no dry place. The liquid grave is not just a metaphor. They are standing in it, and they have to live in it, sleep in it, and fight in it. until they are rotated out or carried out. The descent is complete. The water has won. To understand why the Third Battle of Ypres became a humanitarian catastrophe, we have to look beneath the boots of the soldiers. We have to look at the dirt itself. The tragedy of Passchendaele was not an accident of weather. It was a predictable result of geology and high explosives colliding. When we speak of the Western Front, we often imagine a single, continuous scar. But the earth changes. On the Somme, the ground is chalk. Chalk is porous. When it rains on chalk, the water filters down. The trenches remain relatively stable. But Flanders is different. Flanders is a geological trap. Beneath the thin layer of sandy topsoil in this region lies a stratum of dense, impermeable blue clay. This is the critical factor. This clay acts as a watertight seal. When rain falls here, it does not drain away into the deep earth. It hits that clay barrier and stops. It sits. It saturates the topsoil until the ground becomes a suspension, a liquid solid that behaves less like dirt and more like quicksand. For centuries, the Flemish farmers understood this. Since the Middle Ages, they had engineered a delicate, intricate system of dikes, drainage ditches, and canals to keep the water moving, to force it off the fields and into the sea. It was a man-made landscape, reclaimed from the swamp. Then came the artillery. In the preliminary bombardment for the offensive in July 1917, the British artillery fired over 4 million shells in 15 days. This was not just suppression fire, it was terraforming. We are talking about 9.2-inch heavy howitzers and the relentless pounding of 18-pounder field guns. This iron storm didn't just kill Germans. It obliterated the drainage system. It pulverized the dikes. It smashed the culverts. The intricate vascular system that kept Flanders dry was severed in millions of places. And when the rains came, the heaviest rains in 30 years, the water had nowhere to go. The battlefield reverted to its primordial state. It became a swamp, but it was a swamp made of craters. This created a terrifying new geometry of survival. In dry conditions, a shell hole is a refuge. It offers cover from machine gun fire. In Flanders, a shell hole was a cistern. Consider the crater calculus facing a platoon commander. A 210 mm German Morser shell impacts the soft ground. It buries itself deep before detonating, throwing up tons of wet clay. It leaves a crater 15 feet across and 10 feet deep. Because of that blue clay layer, the bottom of that crater seals. It fills with rain. It fills with groundwater seeping in from the saturated sides. These weren't puddles. They were deep, steep-sided pools of slime. If a soldier, weighed down by his 80-pound kit, slid down the slick, greasy lip of a crater in the dark, he wasn't sliding into cover. He was sliding into a drowning pool. The sides were too steep and too slick to climb out of. Men would cling to the edges, fingernails clawing at the mud, until their strength gave out and they slipped beneath the surface. Lieutenant Edwin Campion Vaughan, an officer in the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, stared out at this landscape on the morning of an attack and noted in his diary that the world had simply ceased to exist. He described it as a vast sea of mud, a lunar landscape where the familiar landmarks, trees, roads, farmhouses had been churned into a gray, uniform porridge. This mud was not inert. It was chemically aggressive. It was mixed with the lyddite and amytal residues from the explosives. It was churned with mustard gas, which settles in low points and binds with moisture. And, inevitably, it was mixed with the biomass of the dead. The Royal Engineers had warned about this. In the planning stages, reports were filed suggesting that a heavy bombardment would destroy the drainage and make the ground impassable for tanks and infantry. These reports were filed, read, and largely ignored by a high command that was looking at maps, not soil samples. So the soldier on the ground found himself fighting a war on two fronts. To his front was the German Fourth Army, entrenched in concrete pillboxes that seemed to float on the mud. But beneath him was an enemy that could not be shot, bayonet, or shelled. The ground itself had become a hostile entity. The trenches they tried to dig collapsed immediately. The parapets were just piles of sludge that stopped no bullets. The floor was a theoretical concept, often 2 or 3 feet underwater. Soldiers spent their shifts standing on submerged firing steps, watching the water level rise, knowing that the geology of Flanders was slowly, patiently waiting to claim them. This was the stage for the battle. Not a field, but a slurry, a liquid grave, engineered by man and sealed by nature. In the hierarchy of suffering on the Western Front, the bullet is clean. Shrapnel is sudden, but trench foot is a slow, biological betrayal. It is the body decomposing while the man is still standing in it. To understand the soldier's existence in late 1917, we must move our focus from the horizon to the trench floor, to the specific medical catastrophe occurring inside the standard-issue British ammunition boot. The pathology begins quietly. It is a product of thermal conductivity. Water conducts heat away from the body 25 times faster than air. When a soldier stands in thigh-deep slurry for 48 hours, a standard rotation in the salient, his feet are not just wet. They are being refrigerated. The temperature of the mud is often just above freezing, perhaps 34 or 35 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the kill zone. It isn't cold enough to freeze the flesh instantly like frostbite. It is cold enough to shut down the vascular system. The medical officers of the Royal Army Medical Corps, the RAMC, began to categorize the stages with clinical precision. It starts with vasoconstriction. The body, desperate to preserve core temperature for the heart and lungs, cuts off blood supply to the extremities. The feet go numb. This is the insidious phase. The soldier feels nothing. He assumes his feet are just cold. He keeps marching. He keeps standing on the fire step. But inside the leather boot, the tissue is starving. Oxygen deprivation sets in. The skin turns a pale, waxy white. Then comes the swelling. The boot, stiffened by the mud, becomes a vice. The leather does not expand, but the foot does. This cuts off circulation even further, creating a feedback loop of necrosis. When the soldier finally crawls into a dugout and pries the boot off, often requiring a knife to cut the laces because they have fused with the leather, the sight is horrific. Medical reports from the time describe feet that resemble dead fish. The skin is mottled red and blue, the stage known as hyperemia. If the condition has advanced, blisters form, filled not with clear fluid, but with blood and serum. And then, the smell. It is a distinct, cloying sweetness. The scent of gangrene. The tissue has died. The boundary between the living man and the dead flesh is drawing a line across the ankle. Captain J.C. Dunn, a medical officer who served with the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, noted the paradox of the pain. The numbness is a mercy. The true agony begins during the thaw. As the feet are warmed and blood attempts to force its way back into damaged capillaries, the pain is excruciating. Termed neuritis, it felt, as one private described, like a red-hot knitting needle being driven through the toes. Men who had endured shelling without flinching would scream uncontrollably while having their feet rubbed. This brings us to the logistics of prevention, which became a grim ritual of the British Army. The command realized they were losing entire battalions not to German machine guns, but to tinea pedis and fungal rot. By the winter of 1917, foot discipline was enforced with draconian severity. The preventative measure was whale oil, gallons of it, a solidified, foul-smelling grease derived from blubber. The orders were strict. Each man had to grease his feet with whale oil once every 24 hours. But you didn't do it yourself. The officers knew that an exhausted man, shivering in the mud, would skip the task. So they instituted the rubbing pairs. Officer supervision was mandatory. Soldier A would sit across from Soldier B. Soldier A would remove his boots and socks. Soldier B would massage the whale oil into his comrade's feet for 10 minutes, working the circulation back into the toes. Then they would switch. It was a surreal, intimate act of survival performed by men trained to kill. An entire platoon, sitting in the filth, rubbing each other's feet in the candlelight, trying to stave off amputation. The socks were another logistical nightmare. Wet wool is abrasive. It acts like sandpaper against softened skin. The army attempted to cycle clean, dry socks to the front line, carried in sandbags by ration parties. But by the time they arrived, the dry socks were often damp from the humidity of the night. A soldier might put on a clean pair that was already moist, seal it in a wet boot, and seal his fate. When prevention failed, the result was surgical. In the casualty clearing stations, the pile of amputated limbs grew outside the operating tents. A foot that had turned black necrosis could not be saved. If the gangrene spread, it would kill the man via sepsis. The treatment was the saw. Thousands of men left the war not because they were shot, but because they stood in water for too long. They were casualties of the environment, dismantled piece by the physics of the trench. The First World War was the apotheosis of the Industrial Revolution. It was supposed to be a war of machines. Engineering, chemistry, and metallurgy were the gods of 1917. But in the swamps of Flanders, the machine broke. The mud of Passchendaele was not just a terrain feature. It was a friction multiplier that neutralized the technological advantage of the British Empire. Consider the infantryman's primary tool, the short magazine Lee Enfield, the SMLE Mark III. In the clean air of a Birmingham factory, it is a masterpiece of tolerance and reliability. It has a smooth bolt action and a 10-round magazine. But tolerances are a liability in the mud. When a soldier crawls through liquid clay, the mud doesn't just coat the rifle, it invades it. It seeps into the magazine spring. It gets under the extractor claw. It mixes with the gun oil to create a grinding paste, a gritty abrasive that acts like cement. The nightmare scenario for the soldier is not the shelling. It is the stoppage. A German patrol emerges from the mist, gray shapes moving across the crater lips. The soldier shoulders his rifle. He cycles the bolt. He pulls the trigger. And instead of the sharp crack of cordite, there is a dull, metallic click. The firing pin has struck, but the mechanism is fouled. The bolt is jammed shut. At that moment, the 20th century dissolves. The soldier is no longer a modern combatant. He is a man holding a useless club of wood and steel. This fear drove a pathological obsession with rifle hygiene. Veterans of the salient didn't just clean their weapons, they nursed them. They used old socks, pieces of torn shirt, anything to wrap the action. The moving parts in a protective swaddle known as a breech cover. The machine gun corps faced a different scale of disaster. The Vickers gun is a beast of a weapon, water-cooled, capable of firing 500 rounds per minute continuously. It is the anchor of the defensive line. But the Vickers requires a stable platform. It sits on a tripod. In the soup of Passchendaele, the tripod legs didn't sit, they sank. As the gun fired, the recoil vibration hammered the legs deeper into the slime. The gun would tilt, throwing off the aim, firing bullets uselessly into the sky or dangerously into the backs of friendly troops. Gunners had to improvise frantically. They scavenged wood, corrugated iron, even corpses, to build rafts for their machine guns. And the ammunition belts, long canvas strips holding the cartridges, were moisture magnets. A wet belt swells. A swollen belt jams the feed block. If the belt dragged in the mud for a second, the grit would enter the chamber and shatter the lock mechanism. But the most spectacular failure of technology was the artillery. The entire premise of the British offensive was the creeping barrage, a curtain of exploding steel that would walk ahead of the infantry. This relies on the shells actually detonating. In the soft mud, the physics of impact changed. A standard high-explosive shell with a Gray's fuse relies on the shock of impact to trigger the detonator. But the Flanders mud acted as a cushion. It decelerated the shell too gradually. The fuse didn't register the hit, or the shell would bury itself 10 feet deep before exploding. The result was a camouflage, a muffled, subterranean thud that shook the ground but trapped the lethal fragmentation underground. The mud absorbed the blast. Regimental diaries from the Royal Field Artillery record frustration at watching barges that should have pulverized concrete pillboxes simply splash harmlessly against the terrain. The dud rate skyrocketed. Some sectors reported failure rates of 30%. That is 1 in 3 shells failing to detonate. And then there was the logistics of movement. An 18-pounder field gun weighs nearly 1.5 tons. A 60-pounder heavy gun weighs over 5 tons. To move these guns forward to support the advance, you need horses and mules. This is where the mechanical horror meets the biological. Drivers describe the roads as porridge. When a gun will slipped off the fascines, the bundles of wood laid down as tracks, it sank to the axle, then to the barrel. Teams of 12, 16 horses would be lashed to a single gun, whipped into a frenzy to pull it free. The animals, exhausted and terrorized, would lose their footing. A mule that falls in that mud, harnessed to a sinking 5-ton weight, does not get up. The suction holds it. The gun drags it down. The drivers had to make the decision: cut the traces and lose the gun, or shoot the animal to stop its thrashing. The routes to the front were lined with the bloating carcasses of horses and the abandoned skeletons of howitzers, sinking slowly into the ooze. The mud didn't just stop the infantry, it disarmed the army. It stripped them of their firepower and left them shivering in the dark, clutching jammed rifles, waiting for the enemy to come. There is a specific horror reserved for the soldier who dies not by enemy action, but by the terrain itself. In the collective nightmare of the 20th century, the image of the soldier shot in the chest is tragic. The image of the soldier vaporized by a shell is horrific. But the image of a healthy, unwounded man slowly disappearing into the earth while his friends watch, that is an obscenity that transcends warfare. By late October 1917, the drainage of the Ypres salient had failed so completely that the term ground was no longer applicable. The battlefield was a suspension of liquid and solid. To traverse this waste, the Royal Engineers laid down a vascular system of wooden tracks known as duckboards. These were wooden slats, nailed to runners, roughly 2 or 3 feet wide. They wound snake-like across the crater fields for miles. In the rear areas, they were a convenience. In the forward zone, they were a lifeline. To step off the duckboard was not merely inconvenient, it was a mortal error. Imagine the logistics of a relief rotation at night. It is pitch black. The rain is falling in sheets, obscuring the vision. You are heavily laden with that 80-pound pack. The duckboards are slick with slime and the vomit of men who have gone before you. German artillery has smashed sections of the track, leaving gaps of 3 or 4 feet that you must jump across in the dark. And then, someone slips. It happens in an instant. A boot slides on the wet wood. A soldier, perhaps a runner from the Sherwood Foresters or a private from the Canadian Corps, tumbles sideways. He lands in the mud. In normal conditions, he would stand up. But this is Passchendaele. The mud here has a specific viscosity. It is heavy, adhesive clay. When a body hits it, it doesn't splash. It accepts the weight. The soldier sinks immediately to his thighs. His first instinct is to thrash, to struggle. This is the panic response. But in a non-Newtonian fluid like this saturated clay, rapid movement only accelerates the sinking. The struggling liquefies the mud around the legs, allowing the heavy body to slide deeper, while the static mud further out remains solid, creating a vice. Now comes the physics of the suction trap. This is the technical horror. As the soldier tries to pull his leg up, the mud forms a vacuum seal around his boots and puttees. There is no air to fill the void beneath his heel. To break that suction seal requires hundreds of pounds of lift force, far more than the human quadricep can generate. The squad stops. They extend rifle butts. They unhook rifle slings to use as ropes. They pull, but they are standing on the slippery duckboards themselves. They cannot get leverage. If they pull too hard, they risk falling in with him. Lieutenant Edwin Campion Vaughan, an officer in the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, documented this specific nightmare in his diary entry from August 1917. He describes the darkness echoing not with the sound of combat, but with the cries of men stuck in the waste. He writes of a man named Decay, though accounts vary on the specific name. The incident is archetypal, who fell into a shell hole. He was not wounded. He was simply stuck. Vaughan and his men tried to pull him out. They pulled until the man screamed that his legs were breaking. The suction was stronger than the integrity of his hip joints. The mud was literally tearing the man apart before it would release him. Eventually, the shelling intensified. The squad had to move on. They had to make the command decision that defines the morality of the salient. To save the unit, the individual must be abandoned. They left him. Vaughan records that as they moved away, the man was still sinking. He was pleading. Later, on the return journey, the crying had stopped. The mud had reached his mouth. This is the psychological zone of trauma that survivors carried home. It is the memory of the conversation. You could talk to the man. You could light a cigarette for him. You could look him in the eye. He is 5 feet away, but he is already dead. The earth is digesting him. There are accounts from the tank corps of crews bailing out of stalled machines, jumping into what looked like solid ground, and disappearing instantly. There are accounts of mule drivers shooting their animals because the beasts had sunk to the belly and were thrashing in terror. But it is the slow drowning that haunts the archive. The duration of the event. A bullet takes a split second. The suction trap takes hours. A man sinks inches per hour. He has time to think. He has time to watch the water level rise toward his chin. He has time to realize that the war has reduced him to nothing more than biomass to be reclaimed by the swamp. When the dawn broke over Passchendaele, the landscape looked deceptively smooth. The shell holes were filled with water, reflecting the gray sky. The surface was unbroken. The evidence of the struggle, the claw marks on the crater lip, the lost rifle had been swallowed. The drowning was complete, and the army moved on, stepping carefully over the graves of men who were still standing up. Rain is typically viewed as a cleansing agent. In the civilian world, a storm washes the streets clean. But in the static, claustrophobic geography of the Western Front, the rain did the opposite. It did not wash the filth away, it circulated it. It dissolved the boundaries between the latrine, the grave, and the living space, creating a homogenized slurry of biological hazard that the soldiers simply called the soup. By November 1917, the Ypres salient was not just a battlefield, it was a vast, open-air septic tank. We must look at the hydroengineering of a trench to understand this. A trench is designed to protect from flat trajectory fire. It is a ditch. In dry weather, you dig a sap trench to the rear for a latrine. You use chloride of lime to sanitize it. It is primitive, but functional. But when the water table rises to the surface, the latrine ceases to be a containment unit. It overflows. The content of the latrine mixes with the groundwater. That groundwater flows into the communication trenches, into the dugouts, and into the shell holes. Father Francis Gleason, the legendary chaplain of the Royal Munster Fusiliers, wrote with a horrified stoicism about the conditions his men endured. He noted that the smell of the salient was not just the cordite sharpness of battle. It was a sweet, cloying reek of wet rot. It was the smell of thousands of unburied men and the accumulated waste of 3 years of static warfare, all churned up by the artillery and held in suspension by the rain. This brings us to the macabre phenomenon of the resurrected dead. The salient had been fought over since 1914. There were layers of corpses beneath the mud. French, German, British, Belgian. Shallow graves were the norm. When the rains came in the autumn of 1917, they saturated the soil to such a degree that the specific gravity of the earth changed. Simultaneously, the process of decomposition creates gases: methane, hydrogen sulfide, cadaveric byproducts that bloat the torso. A corpse is buoyant. As the water level rose in the shell holes and the trench sumps, the dead rose with it. Soldiers on sentry duty would watch the surface of a flooded crater disturb. A hand, gray and saponified, would breach the surface. Then a shoulder, then a face. It was a slow-motion exhumation. Men found themselves sharing a fire step with the bloated remains of a soldier killed in 1915, his uniform disintegrating, his flesh turning to a soapy substance known as adipocere. You could not bury them again. To dig a hole was just to create another pool of water. So you pushed them under, or you lived with them. This environment was the perfect incubator for bacillary dysentery. The causal agent, typically Shigella bacteria, thrives in fecal-oral transmission vectors. In the trench, hygiene was a memory. There was no running water. There was no soap. Consider the logistics of eating. A soldier opens a tin of bully beef. His hands are coated in the mud of the trench wall. That mud contains the microscopic residue of the overflowing latrines and the decomposing bodies. He eats with his fingers. The infection rate was catastrophic. The medical officer reports from the Australian and Canadian Corps show a spike in PAGU.O, pyrexia of unknown origin and severe dysentery during the wet months. This wasn't just a stomach ache. This was a debilitating, life-threatening purging of fluids in men who were already dehydrated. A soldier suffering from acute dysentery is combat ineffective. He cannot man a machine gun. He can barely stand. Yet, evacuation was reserved for the wounded. Men simply defecated where they stood, adding to the cycle of contamination. And then, there were the rats. Ratus norvegicus, the brown rat. They are an opportunistic species, and the Western Front provided an infinite food supply. They fed on the corpses that the rain exposed. They gorged themselves on the refuse. Veterans speak of the rats with a specific, visceral revulsion. These were not the skittish creatures of a city alley. They grew to the size of cats. They were bold. They would scuttle over the faces of sleeping men in the dugouts to get to the rations in their pockets. A soldier would wake up to the feeling of cold, wet feet running across his neck. The horror wasn't just fear. It was a sense of biological usurpation. The soldiers were rotting. Their feet were rotting. Their friends were rotting. But the rats were thriving. The vermin were the only things in Flanders that were healthy. This creates a psychological state of absolute abjection. The soldier realizes he has been reduced to part of the ecosystem of decay. He is not a warrior. He is biomass waiting to be processed. He drinks water that he knows is tainted because the thirst is unbearable. He eats food that tastes of chloride of lime. He sleeps in a dugout that smells of the tomb. The rain didn't just make them wet. It dissolved the veneer of civilization, leaving them to exist in a primordial soup of death and excrement. We often analyze the First World War through the lens of trauma caused by high explosive shell shock, the concussive force that rearranges the neurons. But there is a quieter, more insidious agent of psychological destruction that operated in the Ypres salient. It was the rain itself, not as a weather event, but as a mechanism of sensory deprivation and torture. For the soldier on the line in November 1917, the rain was a constant, deafening static. It didn't stop. It hissed against the corrugated iron of the dugout. It pattered on the steel Brody helmet. It drummed on the canvas of the gas mask satchel. This wasn't background noise. It was an auditory wall. In dry warfare, a sentry survives by his ears. He listens for the snap of a twig, the metallic click of a bolt, the rustle of wire. In the deluge of Passchendaele, the acoustic landscape was erased. The rain masked everything. A German raiding party could cut the barbed wire 10 yards away, and the sound of the cutter's usually a distinctive snip would be swallowed by the downpour. This induced a state of hyperparanoia. The sentry strains his eyes into the gray mist, but he can see nothing. He strains his ears, but hears only water. The brain, starved of sensory input, begins to manufacture threats. A shifting shadow becomes a stormtrooper. A rat splashing in a puddle becomes a grenade landing. The stress hormones cortisol, adrenaline flood the system and never recede. The soldier is locked in a permanent, vibrating state of fight or flight, standing motionless in freezing water. And then there is the cold. We must understand the thermodynamics of a wet uniform. Water conducts heat away from the human body 25 times faster than air. A soldier standing in a dry trench at 30 degrees Fahrenheit is miserable. A soldier standing in a wet trench at 40 degrees is dying. The body enters a state of caloric bankruptcy. To maintain a core temperature of 98.6 degrees, the metabolism goes into overdrive. The violent shivering begins. This is not the shivering of a civilian waiting for a bus. This is a spasmodic, uncontrollable convulsion of the major muscle groups. From a tactical perspective, this is a disaster. A man shaking with advanced hypothermia cannot align the sights of a Lee Enfield rifle. He cannot fuse a Mills bomb. He cannot uncork his water bottle. He is physically disarmed by his own autonomic nervous system. Wilfred Owen, the war poet who served as an officer in these precise conditions, wrote in his letters not of the fear of death, but of nervous exhaustion. He described the universal pervasion of ugliness and the cold that eats the flesh. This wasn't poetry, it was a clinical observation. The cold was a physical corrosive, but the ultimate weapon of the rain was that it murdered sleep. In the forward zone, there were no dry beds. The dugouts were flooded sumps. If a man lay down, he lay in mud. If he sat up, he slept in a sitting position, his boots submerged, water dripping from the timber supports onto his neck. Sleep deprivation became a form of psychosis. Medical logs from 1,917 record men going 72, 80, 90 hours without REM sleep. The brain begins to fracture. French army psychiatrists classified a specific condition known as confusion mental. These weren't men who were scared. They were men whose cognitive functions had simply shut down due to exhaustion. They would be found wandering behind the lines, wide-eyed, unresponsive to commands, unable to remember their own names. They hadn't been hit by shrapnel. They had been broken by the inability to close their eyes without the sensation of drowning. The hallucinations were common. Veterans described seeing battalions of ghosts marching through the rain. They saw the mud turn into faces. This is the 1,000-yard stare, in its embryonic form, the eyes looking at a reality that the brain can no longer process. The rain also destroyed the concept of rest. In other wars, a soldier rotates off the line to a rear area, dries off, and sleeps. In Flanders, the rear areas were just as wet. The tents were leaking. The billets were damp barns. There was no drying out. The moisture was total. So the soldier existed in a continuum of wetness. His skin pruned and cracked. His uniform rotted on his back. His mind, denied the reset mechanism of sleep and bombarded by the white noise of the storm, began to fray. He was a prisoner in an open-air cell, subjected to a water torture that lasted for months. And he knew, with a fatalistic certainty, that even if the artillery stopped, the rain would not. The elements had joined the Central Powers. The armistice of November 1918 silenced the guns. The treaties were signed. The maps were redrawn. But for the men who walked out of the Ypres salient, the war did not end. It simply migrated from the geography of Flanders into the biology of the survivor. The rain had done its work, and it left a watermark on a generation that no amount of peace could scrub away. We often talk about the lost generation in terms of the dead. We count the white crosses, but we must also count the living ruins. The men who returned to London, Berlin, and Paris were physically elderly at the age of 25. The medical files of the British Ministry of Pensions from the early 1920s tell a story not of shrapnel wounds, but of systemic erosion. The primary legacy of the wet war was rheumatism. This is a disease typically associated with the geriatric. In 1920, it was the scourge of the young infantryman. Years of sleeping in waterlogged dugouts, of marching in sodden wool, of standing immobile in freezing mud, had calcified the joints. Veterans complained of a deep ache that lived in the marrow. They were 23 years old, yet they walked with the stiff, halting gait of octogenarians. The dampness had seeped into the skeletal structure itself. Then there was the respiratory legacy. Trench bronchitis became a chronic condition. The lungs of these men had been assaulted by a toxic cocktail of poison gas, coal smoke from trench braziers, and the incessant, dank fog of the Low Countries. When they returned to civilian life, the coughing didn't stop. It became the background noise of British working-class homes for decades. Thousands died quietly in the 1920s and 30s from pneumonia and tuberculosis, their immune systems compromised by the months of exposure. They are the uncounted casualties of the war, killed by the rain on a time delay. We must also look at trench nephritis, inflammation of the kidneys. This was a direct result of cold and exposure. The body, constantly fighting to retain heat in wet clothes, diverted blood flow away from the internal organs. The kidneys failed. Men survived the machine guns only to die of renal failure in a hospital in Birmingham 5 years later. But the most haunting scar was not physical. It was sensory. It was the phantom smell. Neurobiology tells us that the olfactory system is directly linked to the amygdala, the brain's emotional center. For the veteran, specific smells were not just memories, they were flashbacks. The smell of wet wool, the smell of a freshly plowed field after a storm, the smell of chloride of lime, used to sanitize the latrines. Eric Maria Remarque, in his sequel The Road Back, describes the alienation of the returning soldier. He captures the profound disconnect between the clean world of the civilian and the dirty world of the veteran. These men had lived like troglodytes. They had become accustomed to the texture of slime. There are accounts of veterans who, upon returning to their family homes, could not sleep in a bed. The mattress was too soft. The sheets were too dry. The silence of the bedroom was terrifying because, in the trenches, silence meant a raid was coming. Family members would find them in the morning, curled up on the hard floorboards, wrapped in a greatcoat, seeking the tactile familiarity of the hardness they had known for 4 years. And then, there was the rain itself. For the civilian, a rainy day is an inconvenience. For the survivor of Passchendaele, the sound of rain against a window pane was a trigger mechanism. It brought back the suction trap. It brought back the image of the water rising in the shell hole. It brought back the smell of the unburied dead rising from the mud. Post-war asylum records mention men who would go catatonic during thunderstorms. Not because of the thunder, but because of the water. They were seized by a phantom sensation of drowning. They would check their feet for rot. They would refuse to walk on grass if it was wet. This is the final truth of the war against the elements. The artillery shells were recycled for scrap iron. The trenches were filled in by farmers. The wire was rusted away. but the scar remained in the bodies of the men who stood in the water. They carried the mud of Flanders in their lungs and in their joints until they died. The bullets missed them, but the rain caught them in the end.